Good evening, and thank you for joining us for another Cleveland Public Library, the Next 400 digital discussion. I'm Chris Tanaka, evening anchor for 19 News tonight. A very important, very timely discussion on critical race theory, where we separate fact from fiction. I'm joined by two local esteemed panelists tonight who will be weighing in and helping me guide our way through this to clear the air on a topic that has been weaponized, vilified, and overall stir the pot in the American public conscience. Joining me first, Andratesha Fritzgerald. She's an author and educator with the East Cleveland School District. Her book, Anti-Racism and Universal Design for Learning, a great read. Thank you, Andratesha, for joining us tonight. You can unmute. Also, Vice President Robert Solomon, Esquire, from Case Western Reserve University's Office for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity. He's also an associate professor there, joined the campus at Case after an illustrious career at The Ohio State University. Good evening to you both, and thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Chris.
I'd like to jump right in, gang, and talk about critical race theory, beginning with each of yours definition of what it is, because it's something that's been shouted, it's something that's been written, and I can guarantee you ask 10 people what their definition is of it, the vast minority would probably have an accurate take. So just moving across the screen, Robert, why don't you start it off with your definition of what critical race theory is?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Chris. Well, critical race theory really is an approach to analyzing issues that impact society. So it originated in the legal context. So, I'm a lawyer, so this was going on back in the dark ages in the 1980s when I was a law student. And so I'd never even heard of it outside of education. And so you had pioneers like the late Derek Bell, Harvard law professor, NYU law professor, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. And what they did is it was a framework to study how systems in society can impact what's going on based upon race. For instance, like the law and the legal system could actually perpetuate racism or the impacts of racism simply by looking at how they impact it. Redlining is something that was a system that was used to prevent Black people and other people of color from buying homes or getting loans in certain areas. So it really was a system of analysis, and certainly has expanded to other areas of inquiry. But at its core, it's simply an approach to analyzing problems and systems, and certainly isn't focused on individuals.
Yeah. Andratesha?
I would just add to that, it's a way to understand how American racism has shaped public policy. It's a way of thinking to look at constructs, socio-political constructs, and how race manifested in law and politics, economy, and culture. Critical race theory is multifaceted. It is complex. It cannot be whittled down into a us and them or a one side or the other. It is a theory that has a great deal of data and thinking associated with it. So it's a way of thinking and understanding American policy as shaped by the understanding of race.
Yeah. So at 19 News, our racial equity and justice initiative, we've branded the Next 400. We've been exploring a vast current of topics. And some of the examinations I've personally done have been on historical examinations of Black mistrust in healthcare based on racist practices. Obviously, I think over the past year and a half, we've certainly heard mention of the Tuskegee experiment several times as COVID vaccine trials and inoculations have come into the public consciousness. We also did a story on housing discrimination. And Robert, you mentioned that redlining, not just that, but also race-based covenants and more, that lending institutions intentionally shaped how communities were actually constructed racially. Are those examples of the practice of critical race theory in looking at these constructs?
Right. I'll state that those are examples of the kinds of data that one would look at in its full context to see how it had an overall impact on society based upon race. Because of public policy, because of laws that were in place, it was able to shape how communities of color were impacted by those things. You know, give you an example. I remember some years ago, my church in Columbus was selling our church building. We were building a new one, and we were moving into a new one. We were selling our old building, and we saw that there was a racially restrictive covenant in the deed that said that it could not be sold to Black people. Now, you can imagine that this was the law, and that it actually had an impact on so many things in our society. And that was, it's just an example of some of the things that happened. So I would agree that those are examples of how you can use the lens of critical race theory to analyze some of the facts that we've sort of taken for granted, and recognize that they're not random, that they're systematic. And that system has produced where we are today.
Yeah, and speaking of system, Mari Matsuda from the University of Hawaii, who was one of the early researchers on it, Andratesha, she said, the problem is, and I'm paraphrasing, the problem isn't necessarily bad people. The problem is the system that reproduces bad outcomes. Accurate, and can you elaborate?
And so when I think about systems that produce outcomes, it's really critical race theory gives us a lens to look at case studies of data sets. And so my area is in education. And so in the United States, it was against the law for Black people to read. And so when we fast forward ahead to Brown versus Board of Education, where we look at separate but equal institutions, and we know that they were not equal at all. I think we would kid ourselves if we didn't believe that there would be some lasting remnants of the laws of the country, the systems that were in place on the outcomes that are evidenced for our Black and Brown learners. And so when we look at schools, we know that there are, for Black learners, the outcomes are different, and that in the United States, that a Black child is 3 times more likely than a white child to be suspended. So there are some lasting remnants of implicit bias, because if the only commonality for all students, Black students in the country, is the color of their skin, not their background, not their parents, not their communities, they're different in all places, but the same factors come up, then we have to realize that systemically there are some issues. And so when we create standardized assessments that are not culturally appropriate or not culturally relevant for Black and Brown learners, and then hold them accountable to a standard that they did not create or that is not appropriate for their culture and background, we have a dichotomous experience that produces outcomes over and over again that send a message to Black and Brown learners that you are not good enough, you don't have enough, you're not smart enough, when actually it's the instrument that's biased. And so critical race theory gives us a lens to examine the practices, the outcomes, the instrument themselves, so that we can design for better in the future.
Yeah. If it is a scholarly practice of observing data sets, extrapolating information from that, looking at communities and certain outcomes based in certain systems and sectors of our society, why the rage and why the weaponization of the term?
Well, I wish I had the answer to that question. I mean, there's certainly many people who have different perspectives. One of them is that there are people who really have no idea what it is. I mean, I think that is a critical point. There are people who are raging against this notion of critical race theory, and they can't even explain it. They don't even know what it is. It has it's a caricature in and of itself, and it's misleading. And so there are some people who won't take the time to learn what it really is. And I certainly can't judge people's motives. There's some people who think that the motives are political, that people are pandering to a political base. I mean, there's kind of a whole range of things. But my rule of thumb is that if someone is outraged by critical race theory, I can't see how they could understand what it is. I mean, I take those two things hand in hand. If it really scares you, or if you're outraged by it, then chances are you probably don't really understand what it is, because it is not what it's been portrayed to be.
Yeah. Andratesha, what about you as far as how this, how the term itself, if not the practice and the study, has simply been accosted and used to stir anger and division and antagonism? What do you say to that?
I think that critical race theory has become a buzzword, and that buzzword has taken on a life of its own that is separate from the actual theory that was created to analyze this data. And so we have to be mindful in our conversations. Every battle that you're invited to, you don't have to participate. We have to be mindful that in our conversations that critical race theory as a theory, as all theories, can be debated. You can have discussions. You can look through the lens or propose another lens to look through, but it is not created. It was never the intent of the creators for it to be a dividing line for people to pick on one side or the other. It is not a deity to say, I believe in it or I don't believe in it. It is a theory that gives you a way to look at data and to think about it in a different format.
Yeah.
Chris, and I wanted to add that I also think that some of it is rooted in fear and discomfort in discussing matters of race in our society. So
Sure.
all you have to do is throw the word race in there, right? And then all of a sudden, people want to run for the hills. And I think that there's a fear and discomfort that still exists in our society. And the irony is that the notion of critical race theory allows us an opportunity to look at these issues more critically, so that we could get to a better place, so that we could get to some healing and understanding. So it's ironic that there is this movement to stop it, when in fact allowing the discussion will help us to progress as a nation.
Yeah. I love what.
I just wanted to add one thing,
Yeah. No,
that, as you said, that it made me think that the more we focus on the division or the buzz around CRT, then it takes away the opportunity to build structures and systems that no longer perpetuate the racism that is systematized.
Yeah. Yeah. What you focus on grows. Absolutely. I was thinking as you were speaking, Andratesha, that we took, speaking of data, we found a 1936 map actually from the Ohio State University that showed red line neighborhoods that was passed around from a lending institution in Northeast Ohio. And we used a projector to overlay other data sets that are contemporary. And one of them was broadband penetration in Cuyahoga County, which is one of the least digitally connected areas of any major city and any major metropolitan area in the country. And it was almost to the street where the red-lined districts from almost a century ago, in a new way in the 21st century, are still being, not intentionally so, clearly, but still suffering from what happened then, what was intentional. Fortunately, we've got some great nonprofit organizations, Empower CLE, Digital C, of course, the Cleveland Metropolitan School District, that are hyper aware of the disadvantages of especially young people in certain parts of our city that they're able to look at this now and really attack it granularly and accurately to, as you said, come to a better place through this better understanding. And that certainly does give me hope. But when I see intentional falsehoods perpetuated, I wonder how there is, if not a counterattack of truth, an open discussion. How would you go about engaging someone who may have preconceived, incorrect notions of what we're talking about tonight? Andratesha, please go first.
So, if there are misconceptions around critical race theory, I think it's important to spell out what critical race theory is, which we've defined, and then what it's not. Critical race theory is not in any way, shape, or form a blaming mechanism. I think one of the misconceptions is that critical race theory will blame every white person that's alive for things that happened in the past. But what critical race theory is a framework that points out the responsibility that each one of us has to acknowledge the impact of the system on Black and Brown people, and then figure out what we can do to act on the racism that's embedded in the system. That's not attributing blame to a person. It's saying that there are impacts of the system that disproportionately affect a group of people differently than another group of people. And so it's important to realize too that banning critical race theory will not make the impacts go away, and therefore the conversation about the impact will never disappear.
Yeah. Robert?
Yes, absolutely. I think that part of the approach, I think, has to be to really ask questions. Asking people, if someone is opposed to it, I'd want to know why. What about it troubles you? What do why are you fearful of it? Why do you think that it is harmful? Because I think that getting to the root of it put you in a position to provide people with real data and information. Much of what Artisha has already said, that, if you think this is nope, that's not what it is. That isn't how it works. It's not about blame or guilt. It's not about being divisive. It's really interesting because it reminded me of, the old executive order about ending diversity, equity, and inclusion training for federal contractors. And when I read it, the description really blew me away, because the way it was described isn't anything that people do with diversity, equity, inclusion training. That's not what it is. And so I think that if we can get people to engage in the discussion and to really ask some insightful questions, to get them to reveal what's your fear about it, what's your concern about it, why are you opposed to it, and then maybe we can answer some of those questions and have a real discourse. As Artisha says, there's lots of data that's just there. I mean, you can look at the data. This isn't something that's made up, but you can have a different conclusion from the data, of course. But you have to accept they're facts. It really explores factual information that's indisputable. And if you can look at the factual information and say, let's talk about how these facts have impacted society, very, very simply. Let's look at what I call neutral systems that have inequitable outcomes. And then let's explore how we can have more equitable outcomes for everyone by looking at these systems and changing those systems.
Yeah. I know we don't want to dive into the politics of this. So instead of the politics, I'll steer to the legislative side of things, where there are in no fewer than 28 states across the country, language that is being introduced at a state level to, in some way, shape, or form, depending on the legislation, curb and steer the way racial history is taught in the United States. Currently, there are 2 bills moving through the Ohio House of Representatives that have their own mechanisms, but simply put, would do just that. Where then and how then is the approach if the conversation between individuals is to disarm, engage, and enlighten? What is the appropriate course of action at the legislative level when more than half of our country right now is moving in lockstep to affect and change the way our kids learn? Robert?
Well, I mean, we certainly have the legislative process where you can give testimony in the legislature and provide as much information as possible to our legislators and to ask those, to give them those inquiries and to help them to understand the impacts of what some of those things are that's being proposed. Because I think that there's some of them that don't really appreciate the full impact of some of the legislation that's being proposed, and perhaps helping to walk them through the implications of it might help some of them to see it a little bit differently, or to sort of expand their perspective. I mean, and one of the things that Artisha talked about is that the whole idea of education is to, in these areas, is to allow us to learn and do better, right? And we can't do better if we don't look at our history and we don't look at policies and laws that have created many of the inequities that we see today. And it's the only way that you can make progress. I mean, it's what common knowledge that you can engage in a SWOT analysis, right? We could call CRT a SWOT analysis lens, right? Let's look at this and let's try to explore what the virtual impacts of these things are. And I think that we have to engage in the process, and really the political process is vitally important, because we also want to make sure that we have legislators that are, one, interested in listening to the people and are interested in democracy, and then second, are willing to entertain experts and recognize people who understand these things far more than they do.
Yeah. And what would the legislative approach be for you, Andratesha?
So when we think about critical race theory, it's a theory that walks people through thinking about race. When legislation begins to utilize power to tell people what to think and what not to think, that should cause us to pause. And so in that pausing, and we look at here in Ohio, and as you mentioned, 28 states, I find it very interesting that we're trying to legislate a school of thought. And so when we think about this power, in my book, I talk about the difference between power and honor. Legislators who want to control the constituents' thinking by proposing bills like HB 322, and 327. I think we as the constituents, and we as those who elect officials, have to be mindful that if legislating my thinking is what's important for your agenda, then that means you don't trust me and you don't honor me as a constituent. And so honor is a much more powerful tool to ask people what they think, to facilitate discussion, to be a voice for the people, and to be a vehicle for the voices of the people to be heard. That means that we have to be honest about the past. We have to be honest about the impact of the past on today. And if we try to legislate what is taught in K through 12 or in training at the government level, then what that means is that I, the legislator, would like to do the thinking for you. That is not what America is set up for. That is not what a democracy is. And it is insulting to think that critical race theory is one school of thought. However, we are in America, we pride ourselves on freedom of speech, and freedom of thought certainly would be higher than freedom of speech, right? And
Yeah.
so, as we dig into these issues, I would just like to be honored as a citizen to think, and for educators in the field who go to college and earn advanced degrees to design instruction that honors their learners. If we look at our standards, how a democracy is built, the truth is that when democracy is built is when democracy is challenged. And so those challenges of democracy will be erased from the historical teaching. And we cannot afford a society that does not understand how this democracy was shaped, how America came to be, how the contributions of Black people beyond slavery have shaped this country, and have limited the ability of Black people to achieve all that they can. And so, as we look at critical race theory, as we look at this legislation, as we look at the power and the struggle of power and honor, we have to be honest about where we are as a nation, where we are as a people and as a human race. And so, again, critical race theory is one way to look at a set of data that happened, that has occurred, that is occurring. But if we don't have the conversation, then we cannot prevent history from repeating itself.
Yeah, powerful words there. I certainly appreciate that. And again, it's amazing. I think about the course of our discussion, what we've talked about so far. This is a big pond, so to speak, and there's a lot of dynamics to it, and everything within it has a fluidity and interconnectivity that when you start conversing in one corner of it, you're naturally carried upon the current to touch all the others, if you will. Where are we right now? And Andratesha, if you can continue, is there an existential threat, do you feel, to the way we're learning? What can we do locally as a community in our educational systems to make sure that this type of observant thought isn't legislated and isn't subject to anyone else's biased agenda?
So it's important for us to educate ourselves on the legislation that is on the table, that we do, as Dr. Solomon said, that we give testimony and inform the legislators' vote. We also have to be, I think, continue the conversation about power and privilege in America, and who gets to define prohibited concepts, who gets to define what we think. And so we have to make sure that our voices are heard. When you talk about existential crisis, the crisis is that power and privilege is in question. And when there is a conversation on power and privilege, then we see in our society a clinging to power that comes up in legislation like this, that comes up in trying to ban a way of thinking. It's not helpful to ban thought. I think that we have to, regardless of what happens with the legislation, parents, families, people groups have to keep these conversations going, have to educate our students. I have 2 children of my own who are aware of the history, who are aware of the data, who are aware of the impact, and they are able to take the conversation in, even if it's not allowable for a teacher or an administrator to do so. And so we have to remember that as a society, we get to train up the next generation, that these conversations will not go away, regardless of bans or laws or threats, that these conversations cannot go away if we are marching toward a more just, equitable, and inclusive society. Then we have to remember where we've come from.
Yeah, absolutely. Robert?
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, I agree with everything that Artisha has said. The thing that sticks out with me is, I'm sorry, Andratesha, the thing that sticks out with me is after the murder of George Floyd, I found that more people were willing to talk about systems of oppression and systemic racism and all of those issues. And what I found, sort of, as we look at the history, has been mentioned, we see these ebbs and flows throughout history, right? If you will go back to, the Emancipation Proclamation and Reconstruction, you have all this progress and growth, and then all of a sudden you get this backlash for people who really want to maintain these systems of power, and so all of the progress that happened after Reconstruction basically was taken away again, right? Even from the standpoint of anything that was given, the whole 40 acres and the mule myth is that, that former slaves got this, but whatever they got, it was taken away. And by the way, the actual former slave owners are the ones who received reparations, not the slaves. So, so everything was taken away. But then when you go through time, you see these ebbs and flows where we make progress, and then there's retrenchment, and we make progress, and then there's retrenchment. But what I will say is that that Andratesha is absolutely right. No matter what happens with that legislation, it is not going to stop thought, independent thought, and learning. And I think that as a community, that we must be steadfast and continuing to speak truth. We're just providing historical facts and context. I mean, I grew up, and I'm guessing I'm a little older than both of you, but when I grew up, none of these things were in books, right? I didn't learn about Black Wall Street when I was coming through school. All these things happened either in the home. We joke with some people who had that old Ebony encyclopedia. Yeah, you remember those? I mean, that's what we got. My parents shepherded my sense of Black history and things that were going on in society. And really, all we want to do is make sure that all children know about the contributions of everyone to our society. Yeah. And it is amazing that the notion of providing everyone with this information is somehow a threat. And that should concern us. So I do think that we should stay steadfast, one, in staying engaged in the legislative process and the political process in terms of speaking to our legislators, using our voices, going to the ballot boxes, doing whatever we can. But we must also mobilize as community members and make sure that we provide a well-rounded, clear education to every young person that we can come in contact with. And none of that includes trying to make anyone feel guilty, but it's just learning about how society has worked and how things have happened and have benefited some people and not others. But that is no cause for guilt. That's just a cause for us to learn how we collectively can do better moving forward. When you think about all the things that's been omitted in our education, there are things that I never learned in school. I didn't learn about Cesar Chavez. I didn't learn about the Japanese internment camps. All there things were omitted. And I'll say this, and I know this will blow your mind. I know there's a set of textbooks that were used in Texas. I don't know if they still have them, that referred to slavery as workers from Africa. That's how it was described. And that there are textbooks out there that describe antebellum slavery, chattel slavery as workers from Africa. You can see how that's not accurate. And that doesn't help our young people today understand the ebbs and flows and toils of our society so that we won't make those kinds of mistakes in the future.
Yeah.
I would just say that the uncomfortability, the focus being on guilt centers one group's experience over widening the opportunities for all. And so as we move forward, we have to move away from centering a feeling to opening the door to opportunity for every human being to have the opportunity to grow, to learn, to thrive, to enjoy that pursuit of happiness that America promises.
Yeah. Yeah, incredibly well said. I love listening to both of you. You know, I'll share this with you. When we started our initiative, we formed an advisory council of community leaders and stakeholders to kind of shepherd us and guide us, especially in the early stages. And one of our members, Habiba Rashid Grimes, who's the CEO of Positive Education Program Cleveland, said plainly, your history books have been lying to you. And they've been lying for years. And many of the things, Robert, that you discussed that were simply omitted from your texts were omitted from my texts. Yeah. And, you know, being mixed race Japanese, you know, when there were two sentences at the bottom of the World War II on United soil dedicated to, you know, hey, these people, these hundreds of thousands of people were all rounded up and gathered. It's a disservice. It's a disservice not only to those who it affected, but those in the community who don't know. And it's a barrier to progress when you have this lack of knowledge of the world around you, the community around you, the experiences of those around you who are sharing in your space, your emotional space, your economic space, your educational space, and your healthcare space. So I'm deeply appreciative of the measured, rational, scholarly approach that you have both brought to this conversation tonight. I'd like to leave room for each of you to have kind of a final statement, if you will, on critical race theory, where we're at, and whatever it is that matters most to you about our viewers tonight and anyone else who cares to watch this on the Cleveland Public Library's digital platforms moving forward. So Andratesha, please.
Marcus Garvey said, a people without knowledge of its history is like a tree without roots. And I know that a tree that has roots deep down can weather any storm that comes and still stand. And so what's most important to me is that we as a people understand that history has to be taught in truth. And so I would encourage all citizens to visit honestyforohioeducation.info to get more information about House Bill 322 and 327, to compel our legislators to take the limits off of thinking and to encourage more opportunities for discourse, for dialogue, so that we as a human race will have knowledge of our history, of our shortcomings, of our failures, to set up systems that breed hope for the future.
Beautiful. And Robert?
Well said. You know, I would simply say that it's important for us to be able to embrace all of our history. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad, and sometimes that's ugly. We have to shun this notion that anything that reflects poorly on our forefathers and foremothers should be sanitized. And we don't want to deal with the difficult truths that might exist. You know, and I say forefathers because, you know, my great grandfather was described as mulatto and the son of a slave and a white man. So that's my history too. And it's not pretty, but it informs where we've come from so that we can get to a better location than we are today. I would encourage each of us to get comfortable with being uncomfortable and being willing to engage with others who think differently from you, who provide perspectives that you may not have heard, and explore them together and to talk about them together. You would be surprised how you can grow from that experience. And I use this model that we should seek to understand rather than to be understood. And I think that sometimes the effort is to really push our point and our point of view. But when we approach every discussion as an effort to have a better understanding, then we are less likely to dehumanize the person we're engaged with. So I say do that work. There's so much literature and there's so much scholarly reading that you can turn to. Books that I love. Heather McGee's new book, The Sum of Us, is an excellent read, and I would encourage people to pick that up because she talks about how we all can win. And there's a ton of other books that I won't get into a lot of them, but that's one of the more recent scholarly works that can provide some guidance.
Yeah. And of course, our partners at the Cleveland Public Library always do a fantastic job of curating topic-specific reading lists and resources for users of the People's University of Cleveland in all of their 20-plus branches. So we are eternally grateful for the partnership that we have forged with the Cleveland Public Library and the engagement that continues to happen. So anyone watching tonight who wants to further investigate and learn, you can always do so at the Cleveland Public Library's website. Andratesha Fritzgerald, thank you so much for this conversation tonight. It was enlightening, it was inspiring, and I feel renewed. Robert Solomon from Case Western Reserve University, sir, thank you so much. Thank you for being an educator and inspirer and nurturer of young minds as they make their way into the world. We know your dedication comes from passion. And for everyone at the Cleveland Public Library and 19 News who work tirelessly behind the scenes on these endeavors, obviously thanks always go out. For everyone here, I'm Chris Tanaka. Thanks so much for joining us on another Cleveland Public Library, the Next 400 digital discussion.
Thank you.